Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Dr. Anarita Bashalieva with the co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Sherray. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guests. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you very much, Anara, and it's my pleasure to introduce our current and common contributor, Dr. Robert McCollister from Ohio. Dr. McCollister has a Ph.D. from Ohio State University in '92 with a major in international relations and minor in comparative politics, and he specialized in national security policy, arms control, and Soviet politics. At this time, his Ph.D. dissertation was on summit diplomacy, consequences of Cold War summits. He has taught national security policy studies, courses on U.S. military policy at Shawnee State, at Morehead University. He has been a public school teacher for 40 years, and he serves currently on a board of our local nonprofit Tri-State Sunflower Seeds Help for Ukraine. Dr. McCollister agreed to give us a summary of current events, which unravel faster than could have been expected, of course. And before he starts, I will allow myself to share my screen to show everyone, for the record, the map of Kursk. Oops. 1 second. Here is the map of the Kursk area. As everyone knows, probably already in the last 3 days, Ukrainian armed forces made an incursion and captured about 300 to 400 square kilometers of Kursk Oblast of Russia, advancing possibly to Kursk nuclear station at Kurchatov, city of Sudzha. The regional center is now occupied by Ukrainian troops. So these interesting and dramatic events unravel as we speak. I will yield screen to Dr. McCollister, and here is his presentation. Bob, please, the microphone is yours.
Okay, thank you, Victor. Just a little bit about the Kursk. The events around Kursk, it's actually really interesting. This is something nobody saw coming. It is reminiscent of the Kharkiv offensive in the fall of 2022. The Ukrainians have done something which has been very difficult to do, especially in an age of drones and constant surveillance. They've caught the Russians by surprise. It is not clear exactly what their strategic and tactical objectives are, but I think it puts at risk Russia's great Achilles heel, which is logistics. And their logistic network that feeds those troops on the Eastern Front. So we'll see how this all unfolds. If you want to come back and talk about that when I get done, I would be happy to. What I wanted to talk about now actually was something that Victor got me thinking about when we had a discussion in February, or had a presentation in February by Sunflower Seeds in Huntington. And we began to talk about how resonant this is, this period that we're in of the late 1930s, 1938 in particular. In graduate school, I studied, as a minor, particularly Soviet politics, and became very aware of the monstrosities, the true awfulness of the Soviet system, of that far left totalitarian nightmare that Stalin constructed, and especially what it did to the people of Ukraine. I know a lot about Hitler and the rise of fascism, but that wasn't my area of focus. And in recent years, something really kind of startling has happened, is that we've seen fascism return. And I've really done kind of a deep dive. Part of it was kicked off by that conversation with Victor. Part of it I've already been involved in. And I'd be glad to share some of the things I've been reading with the audience. But we have seen the other great monstrosity of the 20th century, that of the far right. We've seen the return of fascism. And I have to be honest, I've been taken aback by it. I did not see that coming. I guess I'd expected that we had buried that monster. But that got me thinking about its relationship to what's happening in Ukraine. And so I prepared this presentation. What we've seen so far in 2024 is an across-the-board Russian offensive near Kharkiv and all along the east and even the southern front, as you can see on this map. And Victor, you can go to the next slide. The Russians have been endeavoring to launch an across-the-board offensive that has had only limited success. It seemed at first time to coincide with the failure of Congress to pass additional aid for Ukraine. But it's continued on, and it has been really remarkable. In a lot of ways, in its failure, it succeeded at a few places, but Russian troops started advancing much faster than a person could walk. And it's happened at the cost of extraordinary casualties. The British Ministry of Defense has estimated that the Russians probably lost 70,000 soldiers in May and June alone, pushing them well above 500,000 casualties since the war began. I mean, those are World War II level of casualties. And the question is, why is Putin making this effort now? And I have come to the conclusion, and it's come from reading a lot of people that are really better informed on this than I am, that this is an explicitly political offensive. In terms, it has a political objective. I mean, the famous phrase from Clausewitz is that war is a continuation of politics by another means. And I think he hopes to gain as much territory as possible in 2024, hoping that political developments in Europe and the United States could create conditions for a ceasefire. Ceasefire talks somewhere early next year, and that he wants to gain as much ground as possible before those ceasefire talks begin, no matter the cost. And that fits in very nicely with what Victor and I were talking about. There are great similarities between the period of the 1930s and the period we're experiencing now. And both are related to the rise of fascism. And fascism, just a real quick definition for those who haven't studied it. Fascism is a philosophy of the far right. It is ultra-nationalist. It emerges in the late 19th century when people distorted Darwin and began to espouse this doctrine of social Darwinism, of survival of the fittest being applied to people, and that government to help people, weaken people, that we should allow the strongest among us to win and allow the weakest of us to die off. That very quickly morphs into a theory of race. You get the development of eugenics, which is very closely tied with the rise of fascism. And these ideas really do spread across Europe and find a much more comfortable home in the United States than we like to remember. There was a fascist movement here in the United States as well, especially in the 1920s and 1930s, where fascism rises in Europe. Much of the rise of fascism in the 1920s and 1930s was related to the shock of First World War and the devastation of the First World War, and then followed very quickly in the late 1920s, early 1930s with the Great Depression. That's where it took root, and those are the things that helped fascism rise to power. In the wake of World War I, you get the adoption of very hyper-nationalist economic policies led by the United States. We adopted very quickly a very, very protectionist economic policy to wall off the United States from foreign trade, culminating with the Smoot-Hawley tariff at the end of the decade. We raised tariffs over the decade, time after time, and the world followed suit. That caused world trade to dry up. I mean, you had a very hyper-connected, very interdependent world prior to 1914, prior to World War I, and now we see the world return to these protectionist policies. That helps lay the groundwork for the Second World War. It especially causes Japan to feel threatened. The Japanese military in particular felt that they were being starved, that Japanese industry, the Japanese economy was being starved by these protectionist measures, and it leads to a drive for autarky, self-sufficiency in Japan, which meant they wanted to conquer their own empire. And so these hyper-nationalist policies began to spread. It's an age of conspiracy theories. Hitler in particular promotes conspiracy theories, the stab in the back after World War I that the German army could have won, but it had been betrayed. And of course, the ultimate conspiracy theory, the idea that Jews were behind Germany's demise in World War I and out to destroy Germany, and that there was this international Jewish conspiracy to dominate world politics. All of these ideas, and you can go on, Victor, to the next slide. All of these ideas found resonance in the United States. The period just or during and just after World War II were a period of real panic about immigration and, well, in the words of Madison Grant, the passing of the great race. One of the most important books written in this period is by Madison Grant, The Passing of the Great Race, where he argues that the people that settled the United States, the great Nordic races that settled the United States, were being replaced by inferior races from Southern and Eastern Europe. This is where the term Great Replacement Theory actually comes from. It's from Madison Grant. And he argued for a much more restrictive immigration policy to limit the ability of those races to come to the United States and weaken what he considered the superior races that had initially founded the United States. Hitler actually called this book his Bible. It leads to the development at the same time. You get this at the same moment in the 1920s, you get the pseudoscience of eugenics, the idea that there are superior races, and those superior races have to be protected. Another American, a guy named Lothrop Stoddard, writes a book, and I've got to look carefully here. I want to make sure I get this right. His most famous book was The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. He is an associate of Madison Grant. He also corresponds with Hitler. And so there is this emphasis on race, on restrictive immigration policies, and that finds root here in the United States. It actually leads to the passage of the National Origins Act of 1924, which was really the first, other than the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I should mention, passed in 1882, was really the first very restrictive immigration policy passed in the United States. And it was aimed at specifically limiting immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and especially aimed at limiting the immigration of Jews, which is a big emphasis for both Grant and Stoddard. In the 1920s and 1930s, those ideas found some fertile ground here in the United States. And there were people who bought into Hitler's view of the world. One of the things that's really hard for us to believe today is that Hitler's Nuremberg race laws were actually based on the American Jim Crow laws. A German lawyer in the early 1930s studied for a year at the University of Arkansas. His name was Heinrich Krieger. Studied our American Jim Crow laws. Hitler was interested how America could have this reputation for democracy and human rights and still practice this extraordinary segregation in much of its society, but especially in the Old South. They studied those, and those became the basis for the Nuremberg race laws. They actually thought our laws, some of them at least, things like the one-drop rule, were extreme. So those ideas were reflected. In fact, when Hermann Goering introduced the Nuremberg race laws, he actually talked about, in front of the Reichstag, he actually talked about how immigration was poisoning the blood of the German people, a phrase that we've heard echoed recently. It's a period in the 1930s where you see the rise of what are these really fascist demagogues like Father Charles Coughlin, who was a Catholic priest in Detroit who had this huge following on the radio. Father Coughlin's radio show got sometimes 30 million listeners. This is at a time when there were only 120 million Americans. Victor, you can go to the next slide. This is actually Father Coughlin. You can see him in one of his addresses. He formed a militia he called the Christian Front. He believed that Christianity was under threat, and they formed a heavily armed militia. In fact, the Christian Front was put on trial for plotting a series of crimes against Jews in the New York area. They were put on trial in Brooklyn in, I believe it was 1940. Ultimately, they were acquitted on technical grounds. There have been some who have linked a series of terrorist attacks, an explosion, particularly the Hercules Munitions Works in New Jersey, perhaps to the Christian Front. An American munitions plant was blown up in, I think, 1940 or 41. I'd have to go back and check the exact date. You had billionaire support. Some of the leading people in the United States, some of the richest folks in the United States, and you can go on to the next slide, led by Henry Ford, are very much a part of this ideology. This is Henry Ford being awarded a medal by German diplomats in 1940. Henry Ford bought a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent, and based on the protocols of the Elder of Zion, a fabricated Tsarist tract that had been written a few decades earlier, he wrote a 91 episode series that debuted, I think, every Sunday for 91 straight weeks. They called the International Jew. Hitler actually had a large portrait of Henry Ford in his office. William Randolph Hearst ran a series of glowing stories about what the Nazis were accomplishing in Nazi Germany after they came to power. But the most powerful of all, the most powerful of these movements and the most threatening was the America First movement led by Charles Lindbergh. Next slide there. You'll see Charles Lindbergh speaking at a rally in Madison Square Garden. This was a powerful movement. He attracted about 20,000 people to this rally in Madison Square Garden. And by the way, I put a link in the chat to a different rally that had been held a couple years earlier in Madison Square Garden, promoted by the German American Bund, which was this neo-Nazi organization in the United States, that also attracted 20,000 people. And if you've never seen A Night at the Garden, you should watch it. It is shocking that this happened in America. And if you look at the next slide, you can see Lindbergh on stage with an American senator, Senator Burton Wheeler from Montana. What America First is this powerful isolationist movement whose entire goal was to keep America out of World War II as the war began. You can see this rally was in May 23rd, 1941. Isolationism had long been a powerful force in American politics. It had dominated American foreign policy through the 19th century. And one of the great debates in Washington was always between the isolationists and the internationalists. The Nazis were working closely with the America First movement. There was a Nazi public relations agent in the United States named George Sylvester Viereck, who recruited not just the leaders of the American First movement. Lindbergh traveled extensively throughout Germany and was welcomed wherever he went, met with Joseph Goebbels and a whole host of Nazis, Hermann Goering. But George Sylvester Viereck worked with 24 members of Congress, especially Senator Ernest Lundeen from Minnesota, Congressman Hamilton Fish from New York, and they used the franking privilege to distribute Nazi propaganda throughout the United States. Not only led to a sedition trial in 1944 in the middle of World War II, where Nazi sympathizers were on trial for trying to undermine the war effort. It's an extraordinary story. If you've never listened to Rachel Maddow's podcast, Ultra, I recommend it to everybody. I learned a lot from listening to it. And the ultimate effect of all this was that it made FDR's attempt to aid the Allies when the war began, and even before the war, in 1937, 1938, 1939, into 1940, it made his life far more difficult because of this powerful isolationist sentiment. As Hitler is gaining power and growing in power, America's on the sidelines. So you can see that across Europe and in the United States, one of the similarities that we see is that there was fascist sympathy across the democratic world in this era, in the 1930s, similar to now, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. You can show the next slide because this is Munich, and that's the ultimate example of Western weakness. Next slide, Victor. This is the Munich Agreement, the ultimate example of Western weakness. FDR struggled to deal with this challenge. Now, what made Hitler's job easier, and I think one of the fundamental differences between that period and the period now, is that in the 1930s and into the beginning of the war, you had a true anarchic international system that was made up of very weak alliances. Alliances very different than what we see in the NATO alliance today. The West had been devastated by the First World War, had been weakened by the Great Depression. Western leaders had no desire to stand up to Hitler and consistently tried to convince themselves that he was not the threat that he seemed to be. And were willing to use what psychologists call inferences of impossibility to dismiss the threat that he growingly was. Not everybody believed that. Winston Churchill was warning throughout the mid to late 1930s of the growth of Hitler's power. But much of the West refused to believe it. FDR believed it, but FDR was weakened by this isolationist sentiment in the United States and could not respond in the way that he wanted to because of this powerful isolationist sentiment. One other difference is very much related to that, and that is following World War I, the United States returned to its isolationist ways, withdrew from the world, essentially eliminated most of its military spending, dramatically downsized its army. I mean, there's a famous example when the war began in 1940, when after the war had been going on for a year, in fact, after Hitler conquered France, the United States held exercises at Fort Polk in Louisiana, which was observed by the Germans and the Japanese. And the United States had 13 tanks. There were 13 modern tanks in the United States Army in that exercise in 1940. 13. Literally, tank crews were driving trucks with big signs on the side that said tank. Mortar crews were throwing bags of flour. I can actually show you this film. But Pearl Harbor obviously ends all this. This idea that the United States could isolate itself from world politics. And what you see here, this is FDR giving his State of the Union address in 1941, a few months before we're pulled into the war at Pearl Harbor. This is his For Freedom speech. And much of what he talks about, this is truly one of the important speeches of the 20th century. Much of what he talks about becomes the basis for what would follow. Because post-war, the leaders of the United States, FDR, Truman, Eisenhower, the Democratic and Republican presidents, the bipartisan consensus in Congress, and all of our allies build a very, very different world. A world that has led to the longest period of great power peace since the rise of the nation state in 1648. It was based on a few simple principles. That the United States and its allies would not adopt protectionist economic policies, that they would link their economies, that, like Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, the father of modern capitalism, that one of the things that will help guarantee world peace is free trade across borders, because countries that link their economies are less likely to go to war. So they build a free trading system, an open trading system. No trading system's ever perfectly free, but they built a much more integrated economic system at Bretton Woods, beginning at the Bretton Woods Conference in July 1944. So we linked our economies together. The Europeans linked their economies even more closely through what eventually became the EU. Jean Monnet and Albert Schuman and a whole series of very far-sighted European leaders began to link their economies, not to exclude the United States, as is sometimes said, to try to cheat us on trade. They began to link their economies to prevent another world war. And it was successful, so successful now, it's impossible to imagine a war between France and Germany. That's a pretty remarkable statement. That is a pretty remarkable statement. And through the Cold War, the United States and its allies linked their economies, but we also linked our security. And Victor, you can go on to the next map. Through the most remarkable alliance ever built, the NATO alliance. The NATO alliance is unlike anything that had ever preceded it. The NATO alliance, you can see it through its waves of expansion on this map. The NATO alliance integrated its command structure. The Supreme Allied Commander in Europe is always an American general. The Secretary General is always a European. Our forces train together, they plan together, they are tightly integrated in a way no alliance had ever done before in history. This is not your father's military alliance. It is really an extraordinary creation that all Americans ought to be proud of. Created in April 1949, initially with 12 countries, now 32. With the addition, actually, I didn't notice, this is an older map. This one doesn't include Finland and Sweden, which have just now joined. And so we build this system that keeps the peace in the Cold War, that protects Western values. And that's the other thing that FDR talked about in the For Freedom speech and becomes a cornerstone of this new rules-based international order. And that is, it is built on common values, on an emphasis on democracy, on a respect for human rights and human liberty, and all the great freedoms that we exercise in this country and across the democratic countries all over Europe now. It was built on this foundation of shared values. One other thing was this begins the idea, which becomes a norm in international politics, that acquisition of territory by force is now unacceptable, that is beyond the pale, that the age of conquest and empire building is over. And so we built this system, and the system is remarkably successful. It ultimately stands down that monstrosity, the Soviet Union. It leads to victory. And you can go on to the next slide. Victory, the point where by the early to mid 1990s, when this is a map from Thomas Barnett's book, The Pentagon's New Map, which is now an older book, everything, it's a bit complicated, but everything outside those dotted lines is what my old Ph.D. advisor, Dr. Krusel, used to call the zone of peace. Almost all the conflicts you see by the little circles on the map are in the Persian Gulf region in the Middle East, or in places outside that zone of peace, with a few dots up there in southeastern Europe. That's the wars with the collapse of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. So we built this system, and it led to victory in the Cold War. As you can see on the next slide, you can go ahead and change victory. You can see that the celebration when the wall came down, November 8th, 1989. Never forget it. Anybody that lived through it cannot forget it. I saw things in that period I never thought I would live to see. Never thought I would live to see. But we know that's changed. So what about 2024? What are the similarities to the 1930s, and what are the differences? Because any historical analogy is imperfect, but I think there are lessons to be learned from it, not only from the similarities, but from the differences. The fact is that Putin is the face of fascism. Fascism has returned, and its leading spokesman is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin kills his political opponents. Next slide, please. He kills his political opponents. It's good. Go on to the next one. I think I got them slightly out of order. There we go. People like Alexander Navalny. Even more importantly, understand Putin's objective. Putin's objective is to destroy the rules-based international order created after World War II. It is to weaken American power because it is the ultimate barrier to the expansion of Russian power and the restoration of the Russian Empire. Next slide. One of the things Putin has done, in addition to the use of military force, is that he has tried to use Russian influence, Russian money, social media, and all the tools of the modern world to undermine the Western world from within, to undermine the US-led alliance, NATO, and other alliances around the world by aiding these ultra-nationalist, neo-fascist, if not actual fascist political parties across, especially Europe. And to aid these, he has aided the National Rally in France, actually loaned Marine Le Pen's party money because they would undermine the NATO alliance and help for Ukraine. He has helped the League in Italy and Matteo Salvini, the Freedom Party in Austria. He has built links to these fascist parties all across Europe, and parties that are at best neo-fascist. The Alternative for Germany party in Germany, yes, a fascist party, has considerable 15 to 20% support inside Germany. as ominous as that sounds. And in some ways, his most important success is helping Viktor Orban in Hungary, who literally is the fox inside the NATO henhouse. Orban has destroyed Hungarian democracy. He has imposed very close to fascist rule, at the very least, fascist adjacent rule. He's destroyed democracy by following Putin's playbook. First, you seize control of the press and the media. You eliminate an independent press. You seize control of the courts. And then you seize control of the election system through extreme gerrymandering. He has now rigged the parliament in Hungary so that he cannot lose. Hungarian democracy has been effectively destroyed. And behind the scenes, now Putin doesn't control these. This is not like the old Comintern days. He doesn't control these, but he has influence all over these parties. Matteo Salvini in Italy, the leader of the League, used to run around with a Putin shirt on all the time. They've all made the pilgrimage. You could go on the internet and find pictures of Marine Le Pen making the pilgrimage to Moscow and talking to Vladimir Putin. He was very much involved in Brexit, in what ultimately turned out to be a disastrous move. And you can go to the next slide. A disastrous move that led Britain to leave the EU overwhelmingly now, the British people realized that leaving the EU was a mistake. Putin played a role, helped fund, used his social media tools to encourage the Brexit vote. And it's been a disaster for the British. So we've seen the rise of these movements. The United States is not exempt from this. We have these voices in the United States as well. And I don't want to go to this too much, but again, you've got a series just like with Henry Ford and William Randolph Hearst. You've got people like Peter Thiel. Peter Thiel has now been arguing that he believes that democracy and freedom are no longer compatible. David Sachs, another Silicon Valley billionaire, and that's where most of these guys come from, is very much pro-Putin and very anti-war in Ukraine. You've got people like Curtis Yarvin, who is a very influential, I guess you would call him, political philosopher. Again, it comes out of Silicon Valley, who's calling for a Red Caesar, for the end of American democracy and replacement with a national leader. And you've got the national conservative movement rising, which has some very troubling ideas. Follow James Pogue and his writings about the national conservative movement in Salon magazine. It's really eye-opening. And Putin's goal, again, is to destroy this system, the American center of gravity, use another term from Clausewitz, the American center of gravity has always been this alliance system. It is the greatest source of American power. An example I give when I talk to folks, do you know how many overseas bases China has? 1. Russia also has 1. China's is in Djibouti, in the Red Sea area. Russia's only overseas military base is in Syria. I think it's Latakia, that's how you pronounce it. The United States has 750. Our alliance system gives the United States military the global reach to protect not just our interests, but to also keep this well-integrated alliance system operating. It also protects world commerce. Very important. And he wants to undermine that because he understands he cannot restore Russian power until he destroys the rules-based international order. So we see echoes of the 1930s. Putin is very much the face of this new fascist movement. And one other thing I'll mention, this time it's not just Europe, it's not just the United States. This is worldwide. And to some degree, these very ultra-nationalist leaders are aligning themselves with religious movements too. Modi and Hindu nationalism in India, he comes out of the Hindu nationalist movement, the old RSS it was called, that actually assassinated Gandhi because of his support for a secular India that respected both Hindus and Muslims. Modi is very much in that Hindu nationalist tradition and has been persecuting Muslims. Erdogan in Turkey. We see these leaders. Orban in Hungary, the Justice and Law Party, which recently was voted out of office in Poland, was very much aligned along those terms. We see those religious nationalist movements powerful. We see these fascist dictators, to give themselves legitimacy, aligning themselves with religious institutions. Putin is also pioneering that with his very, very close ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. And if you saw the Russian Orthodox Church's edict that they issued this last spring, they called the war in Ukraine a holy war, called for a rebuilding of Russian power, building a Russia of 600 million people. So that's another interesting element. It actually applies to the war in Gaza as well. It's really interesting because you've got the two sides, Hamas and the most conservative parts of the Israeli government, Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir, and others who are very much on the same page as the religious nationalists. They just don't like each other. But that's that's a whole other podcast. But I do think there are differences. I think the West is in a far better position in 2024 to oppose this than it was in 1938. And you can show the next slide. I show this at all my sunflower seeds presentations. This is actually a billboard that Putin has put up facing, I think it's Latvia. And Victor, you may, excuse me if my Russian translation of this is wrong. I believe it says something along the lines of the Russian bear knows no borders. Is that about right?
It just says the Russian borders never end.
Okay.
There is no boundary.
Yeah, I think the message there is pretty clear. But I think we're in a different position. Now, it's interesting that it's taken us a while to get there. One of the great strengths about the NATO alliance is it only acts by consensus. We specifically created an alliance in 1949, which the United States would lead, but it would not dominate. NATO only acts when all 32 clocks strike simultaneously. That is a great strength of NATO, but it can be a weakness too. And Putin's aggression begins really in Georgia in the late summer of 2008. And to be honest, and this is similar to late 1930s, to be honest, most Western leaders, the Bush administration, but especially in Europe, especially the Germans and the French, didn't see this as decisive, didn't see this as disqualifying, as something they had to immediately rally against. The West was divided. And the Western response to the invasion of Georgia in 2008 was relatively weak. In 2014, when following the Revolution of Dignity in Kyiv, Yanukovych was forced to leave, and Putin reacted by seizing the Donbass and Crimea. Again, the West was divided. Now, the interesting thing here was that Putin was much smarter in 2014, 2015 than he was in 2022. It was a much more subtle approach. Remember the little green men? Seizing Crimea really wasn't all that difficult for him because the Russian military already had bases in Crimea. It was actually relatively easy for them to take it. And they could infiltrate Russian troops disguised as these little green men into the Donbass and seize the area and take advantage of what was real Ukrainian military weakness at that point. Now, this gets into a whole other series of things about the problems of Ukraine and corruption and Russian influence inside the Ukrainian military prior to the war. But again, the West was still divided in 2014. And especially the Germans and the French were not ready to take really serious actions against Russia. There were economic sanctions. They had some bite, but they were not nearly strong enough. The Obama administration, because of the division of the West, but also because, to some degree, people in the administration wanted to hope that there was still a possibility of diplomatically solving this, took action. The action was not as weak as it is sometimes portrayed. It wasn't just blankets and beans. It was, we gave them a whole series of what turned out to be important steps, things that would aid their development, especially training. We also sent them counter battery artillery, artillery counter battery radars, logistic things, the things they were what they needed most. What the Obama administration decided not to do was send weapons. And that was a mistake. I think everybody sees that as a mistake now. So the West was still divided. The response, while stronger than in 2008, was still inadequate. 2022 was a whole different kettle of fish. Very different than the 1930s, very different than Munich. Putin was less subtle. This was a blatant violation of the norms of the post-war world, and an invasion, the largest land invasion since World War II. It was dramatic and undeniable. And the West's reaction this time was far more forceful. Now, we can argue about exactly when aid was given and try to rewind the clock and see what could have been done, and hindsight is always 2020. But overall, particularly at strategic level, this has been a very forceful response. NATO has now expanded to 32 countries. Sweden and Finland are now in NATO. Russia's security position is much more tenuous. Has the aid been a little too slow to get there? Yeah, it took us too long to get them F-16s. Yeah, it took us too long to get them ATACMS. That's absolutely true. But particularly at a strategic level, I think the response has been very strong. And overall, the Western response to Russia's invasion has been much more powerful than people sometimes give it credit for. I think the Biden administration and our NATO allies have done a really pretty good job here. The question is, what happens if the West stays strong, if the West continues to aid Ukraine? We can blunt Russian aggression. And you can go on to the next slide. We can blunt Russian aggression. Our allies have given far more than we realize. You can see that if Russia were to take Ukraine, I think the absorption of Belarus and Moldova would follow very quickly. And now you would have Russian troops all across the border, bordering Poland, bordering Romania, bordering Bulgaria, but especially bordering the Baltics. And like Anara's great presentation a few months ago, really tempting Putin to try to restore that passage that would connect Kaliningrad to the rest of a newly expanded Russia. And I think the Baltics would be under great threat. And if that is true, those countries are part of the NATO alliance. They are part of our Article 5 commitment that an attack on one is the same as an attack on all. And if Ukraine were to fall, I think the analogy to the late 1930s would be much more persuasive. All right, I've gone on for a long time now. We can talk about it. We can talk about how things could have been different if you would like, or talk about Kursk. But if you've got any questions, feel free to shoot away.
Thank you, Bob. I will stop sharing now and give screen to everyone. Thank you for this very comprehensive lecture. And I see Dr. Deutsch, please.
Hi. If there's a 50% chance that at this point that Donald Trump may win the upcoming election, and he seems to be have a very positive attitude toward the right-wing leaders that are tyrannical. What then would be we seem to be going down a fascist rabbit hole of our own if that occurs. What would be the solution short of World War III?
Well, the solution is to not let that happen in the first place. If the United States were to withdraw from NATO, which in the past, and I've tried to avoid current politics as much as I can, but if we were to go down that path and withdraw from NATO, which Trump has hinted he wants to do multiple times. John Bolton said at the NATO summit in 2019, I believe, that as he was about to make his presentation, he called John Bolton up and said, "What if I announce our withdrawal from NATO?" If we were to do that, I think that would have devastating consequences. I think it would have absolutely devastating consequences. If you listen to J.D. Vance, he has made over and over again, made it clear that he does not care about Ukraine. Now, whether Donald Trump would actually do that or not, I can't predict the future. I would hope he could be persuaded not to. But that's a consequence I'd prefer not to think a whole lot about, because I can't imagine something that would have more devastating consequences for world security. It would be the collapse of the rules-based international order. It would dramatically weaken American power. We cannot return to our isolationist past. There are serious problems the world is facing that only can be solved with international cooperation. And I think the big three are, we're entering a new age, a new era of nuclear, not proliferation, but the growth in nuclear arsenals, especially among the great powers. A new nuclear arms race is literally, it's underway. We need to restore the arms control process. We need international cooperation to fight climate change. We need international cooperation on artificial intelligence. Those three issues come to mind on the top of my head. So I think the maintenance of the American system is, this rules-based international order is of paramount consequences for the future.
Thank you, Bob. Any more questions to the speaker, please?
Dr. McCollister, thank you so much for yet another amazingly educative presentation. I thank you for taking a lot of complex material and putting it in a format that that we can understand. Thank you for this. I would love for you to speak a little bit more about the current events that are happening right now in Kursk. I apologize for the mispronunciation. Can you you mentioned before that Ukraine is the only country to invade a nuclear power, and I know that's
I said this. That's kind of tongue-in-cheek note from.
No, I know, and I realized that.
From the web. Yes.
Yeah, I realized that's I don't want to put too much. I don't. It's just kind of a neat little fun fact, I suppose. In a time where fun facts are are not what we're talking about. But can you talk a little bit more about what the implications are of this invasion of Ukraine into this region? From what I understand, it's an administrative center. It's not just a random town. Can you please talk a little bit more about that and help us understand the significance and of what's happening, the current events?
Well, first of all, a little bit on the nuclear thing. I think this is absolutely important that Putin is as a nuclear power is trying to use nuclear weapons as a shield to protect the invasion of another country. One of the things about nuclear weapons is they have such limited utility. They're just not good for much. They're so destructive. They're so awful. They have very little military utility. What he's trying to do is invent a new reason to have nuclear weapons. That if you have nuclear weapons, you can invade your neighbors, and other countries are afraid to intervene. So I think it's important that we prove, that we show, and you do have to be careful, and the Biden administration has been very concerned about the possibility of Russian first use. But we have to prove to the world that nuclear weapons do not have that purpose, that they cannot be used as a shield to allow a new era of conquest, a new era of imperialism. In terms of the Kursk operation, boy, this is so new. And people who are far more versed in, actual military operations than myself are still trying to figure out exactly what's happening. It's interesting that they've done this in a way that was absolutely unexpected by the Russians. That in a period of, people talked a lot about war is no longer, the fog of war, as Clausewitz talked about, no longer exists, that with drones and everything's transparent and you can always see when an enemy is massing forces. The Russians didn't see this coming. And this now looks to be a much larger operation than we thought it was initially.
Wow. I was a total surprise to me. I was talking to my dad last night and he asked me what about the latest news, and I missed it. I appreciate you kind of putting out the context that this truly is a surprise.
Yeah, it really is a surprise. I think what the Ukrainians are trying to do is disrupt Russian logistics. A lot of the train networks, the Russian military moves by train. Tanks don't drive places, okay? Only when they're in attack. They move by train, okay? And they move massive numbers of men and artillery and munitions and tanks, and they move by train. And that network that feeds that eastern front in the Donbass all runs through Belgorod and that area just across the border. I think that may be the objective, is to disrupt the supply that gets to, understand, they've already disrupted a bunch of the supply that goes by sea to Crimea. That has been very successful. And now this could starve Russian forces even more. The Russian Achilles heel has always been logistics.
Wow.
And their lines of communication.
Wow. Anara, come on in. I know this is something.
No, thank you. I exactly wanted to ask questions related to your question. So that surprise, what surprises people, and several sources say that Russian General Gerasimov, General Staff, actually, he's the chair of General Staff, Valery Gerasimov, knew about Kursk region attack 2 weeks ahead, and he did nothing. And that's why we don't understand Russian side, what is happening, and some rumor that Putin is not real Putin. The Gerasimov was killed, he is not real Gerasimov. So that's a confusion. And my question is, what your actually possible scenarios, positive, pessimistic, and optimistic scenarios of the developing war on Russian territory?
That's a really good question. And it's something that everybody's talking about right now. What are the strategic objectives? What are the tactical objectives? Is this a force that can be maintained on Russian territory with a Russian counterattack?
Yeah, I'm reading now from the AP. Sorry.
Yeah, that's really, it's very difficult to say this early in the attack, this early in the offensive. So I don't know exactly what the objective is. Is this something to temporarily disrupt, or are they trying to leave a force in place? Is this a way, this could have political objectives to weaken Putin's standing inside Russia, to make Russia look vulnerable to the Russian people. So I think it's really just early to say. I don't think we know exactly what Ukraine is up to, but it has got Russians on the back foot, and they're trying right now to counterattack. There's just a news that just broke not too long ago that the Russians tried to rush a battalion-sized unit to the front, and it got decimated by Ukrainian air power.
Yeah, I'm looking at an Associated Press report right now. This is Mikhailo Podolyak, top advisor to President Volodymyr Zelensky, said Thursday that border region attacks will cause Russia to start to realize that the war is slowly creeping inside of Russian territory. He also suggested such an operation would improve Kiev's hand in the event of negotiations with Moscow. I mean, but still, as you say, it's way too early to tell. So I appreciate your perspective and commentary. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCollister. August, I see your camera open.
Yeah.
Hello.
I will
You have a
ask
question.
not a question,
Please.
so much, but a comment. You did a great job outlining the history of isolationism in the 20s and 30s. Madison Grant was new to me, but I'd like to just make one point that they were not universal. In 1939, a Princeton research project was begun to monitor Nazi and fascist shortwave broadcasts. And that was taken over by the War Department and moved from Princeton to K Street here in Washington, and it became Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which still continues to this day. We're not given free copies of it. So there were other people thinking internationally at the same time.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And it was a great debate. It was a great debate within American politics about what should America's role be and should we get involved? What should that involvement be? FDR very carefully managed that. And through 1940-41, and even Newt Gingrich called it the greatest act of leadership of the 20th century, how FDR in 1940 and 41 slowly, step by step, moved America toward aiding the Allies. First, the destroyer deal, where we gave 50 old destroyers to the British, the resumption of the draft, then Lend-Lease, and finally the Atlantic Charter. He moved the United States down the road very carefully in the way that, FDR being the great politician of the 20th century, using that term not pejoratively, the great master of American politics, was able to do that. But that's absolutely true. It was not universal. But we do tend to overlook, as we look back on that, triumphant World War II history, we do tend to overlook that there was sizable support for Nazi Germany here in the United States.
Yeah, that was actually one of the more sobering moments of your presentation. The fact that Germany used our Jim Crow laws, and that there was even a connection between those two was amazing, and also the portrait in Hitler's office. It's history we don't know and don't study. Thank you. Yeah, that's very sobering.
Now, if you would like, there's a couple books. I mentioned Rachel Maddow's book, Prequel, but if you would like to read a book about this, Isabel Wilkerson, who is one of the most extraordinary authors of recent times, she wrote a book about the Great Migration, The Warmth of Other Suns, which is just, I think it's my favorite book. But her second book was called Caste. And it compared the caste systems, the Jim Crow caste system in the United States, to what happened in Nazi Germany, to what was happening in India. And it's just a masterful book. And that's where I first learned about that.
We have some activity in the chat. I'm seeing articles about President Trump helping and sending weapons to Ukraine early on. That Trump was the first president to provide Ukraine with military weapons, including Stingers and Javelins. I wonder what has happened. What has happened to change? Because historically, conservatives have been strong against Russia. What has happened from then to now because if this is true, if what we're reading is that he was the first to provide Ukraine with military weapons and be supportive, and without the weapons he provided, Kiev would have been overrun in the first few days. So any ideas what happened, how we got from where there to here?
Well, I mean, there's a lot there. When did the isolationist wing of the Republican Party start to turn? A lot of people date that with Pat Buchanan in the 1990s, with Pat Buchanan's famous speech to the Republican Convention in 1992. He actually used the term America First. Trump did provide weapons to Ukraine. That is absolutely true. It is also true that he had to be convinced to do that. And Foreign Policy's got a great article about that. He was personally reluctant to do it, but his national security advisor at the time, H.R. McMaster, who I have followed very closely from his career in Iraq. I've actually got his dissertation on my bookshelf. He's a very, very smart guy. Was national security advisor, was Trump's second national security advisor. General Mattis at the time, Secretary of Defense. Convinced Trump, who reluctantly went along with arming Ukraine. But he did send, it was 37 launchers, and I actually wrote this down, 210 missiles, about $47 million. They were not allowed to be used. They were kept in storage in Lviv and not used as the combat continued in the Donbass. But they were there almost as a deterrent. When the Russians invaded, they were then brought out of storage and used. So that is true, and that's a accomplishment of the first Trump administration. But it was clear from the beginning that Trump personally was not a supporter of, excuse me, how do I say this? He was not emotionally invested in the defense of Ukraine. And that his relationship with Putin was paramount to him. And if you watch the Helsinki summit, if you watched his other interactions with Putin, he clearly valued that relationship more than really any other.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob.
Yes.
Any more questions, please? Well, Leslie has a question. Please, Leslie, I see your hand.
Hi, Bob.
Hi.
So, basically, my question is basically kind of a public relations question, so I'll apologize in advance for that.
Okay.
But I think that in the wake of Ukraine invading Russia in a big way now, I think there will probably be some people who will argue that Ukraine has lost some kind of moral authority. I don't agree with that sort of argument because I consider myself a pragmatist and Russia started this war. Ukraine has a right to defend itself, including by attacking Russia. But what would you say would be the best way for supporters of Ukraine to combat that sort of rhetoric?
Well, I think you just did it. This is, a country that this is an act of self-defense. Russia started the war. Russia chose war. What is Sherman's quote? War is the remedy our enemy has chosen. So I say, let them have as much of it as they can stand. So yeah, Ukraine is absolutely justified in responding to Russia. Now there's fear of escalation, and that's in some ways that to too large a degree, that's kind of been a limit on the Biden administration's aid to Ukraine, that they've been very careful about that nuclear threat. But I think time and time again, what we've seen is that red line for Putin keeps getting pushed back. That they have, cried wolf on nuclear weapons so many times that it's become clear that the choice to employ nuclear weapons would be one that would be a shattering event in post-World War II history. So I think we've all become convinced that it's the boy who cried wolf. And Ukraine is fully justified in responding.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob. I would add here, we didn't mention today that the fighting actually goes on in about 20 miles distance from Kursk nuclear station, nuclear power plant, which provides electricity for the several regions of southern Russia. If Ukrainian troops aim to seize the Kursk nuclear power plant, this would be a standoff situation with Russians who seized Zaporizhia plant 2 years ago. So this would be a very large reason for negotiations of any kind, and obviously expulsion of Russian troops from part or all of the occupied area. Of course, there is also, I'm reading news right now from Ukrainian channels. They change by the hour. It's hard to know what is confirmed, but it's clear that Putin's generals, first of all, do not report the situation to the authorities or even to local people to full extent, that the local people are completely lost, trying to evacuate, not given any protection needed. And one of the very indicative for Russian reality points was yesterday when Russian troops retreating arrived to a local hospital, and local hospital in Kursk region was locked with a large padlock because the doctors ran away. Wow. So that's how they protect their own territory. And we are seeing, in my opinion, very similar situation to last year's June, to Prigozhin March, under different circumstances, but we see a Russian population, which is including the army, unable and even unwilling to resist even small incursions like this. We're talking maximum maybe 1,000 people of Ukrainian troops. It's not the major incursion. But I also need to add that this is a very populated area. These maps are deceiving us. It's area about the same density of population as here in West Virginia. You have towns, large towns every 20 miles or 10 miles or so. You have what they call villages, may have 1,000 inhabitants. What they call small town may have 100,000. So this is a very populated area, very important for both Russia and Ukraine, agricultural area. So it's also about 400 miles to Moscow. So some commentator said yesterday, if they advanced with this speed, by mid-September they will be in Moscow. Of course, they will be not, but potential is clear. Russia is big, but most of it is like, frozen like Canada. So the important functional part of Russia is not that big, as you might think. And obviously, we're talking about a large urban population here, which presents enormous difficulty for any kind of evacuation. So we can predict that in situations like this, what we see today, yesterday, government simply will abandon the population without any help. And then Ukrainians have to manage this situation. And obviously, we already see that Russian planes are bombing their own territory, infrastructure, to try to repel Ukrainians, which is completely different ball game. Of course.
Yeah, they may have to start blowing their own bridges.
Yep, I'm no military analyst, but you don't have to be to understand that this changes situations. I think Russia already lodged some complaints in the United Nations, which is very ridiculous.
Yes.
Okay. If we have no more comments or questions, I will thank Dr. McCollister for comprehensive historical lecture, very relevant to today and tomorrow's events. Thank you so much. It was 128th weekly meeting of Ukraine podcast at Marshall University, West Virginia. Dr. Shrey, please.
Дорогі браття, сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня. Прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!